So we're here on the bottom of Mem Gimel Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, and we're about to raise an objection to Rabbi Shita. We're about to prove that we don't say Hoil. Right now, there are no Orchim. We don't expect any guests to show up. We don't anticipate Orchim. He's already eaten his Sudas Yontif. Why should we assume that any guests will show up? But Rabbah says, no, the possibility does exist, as theoretical as it seems, that this afil will be an afil Litzarch Yontif if guests will show up. So Sholach le Rav Chizl Rav Biad Rav Acha bar Rav Huna. The shliach here was Rav Acha bar Rav Huna, who was sent by Rav Chizda to Rabbah. And Miyamrin and Hoel Vatnan, we have a Mishnah in Masechet Makos. This Mishnah in Masechet Makos is one of the Mishnayos in Shas that counts with one Maisa, how you can violate multiple Chiyuvei Malchus. And in this case, Yesh Choresh Telem Echad, he is implementing an act of Charisha. He's plowing a furrow in his field. V'chayoven aleha mishum shmona lavin. He will violate 8 different chiyuvei malchus with one act of charisha. And we're going to go through all 8 cases and all 8 violations, but the one that we're most interested in, and it's going to call our attention, is going to be Yantif, which is on the next Amud, on Daf Mem Ches Amud Aleph. But be that as it may, we start with Hashar Vehachamor Yachtav. The Torah says, in Kitetze lo Sachrosh Bishar Ubechamor Yachdav. So now he's doing a Charisha with both a Shar and a Chamor. And the Torah prohibits that in a lav. Now, one of the interesting things here that we want to comment on is that, let's say he had many shvarim and many chamorim. Would he violate a chiv malchus for every single shar and every single chamor? Meaning, let's say he has 3 oxen and 3 donkeys, he should get 3 sets of malchus. If the Mishnah has as its goal to maximize how many chiv malchus you could have with one act of charisha, then why not just add to the number of animals? So this is a question that's actually raised by Tosas Rabbeinu Peretz, and he says that he wants to derive a pretty radical conclusion from this, and he says, don't accept the classic answer to this question that he just wants to, the Mishnah wants to just count up different lavim, different categories of lavim. So by adding extra shvarim and extra chamorim, you're not adding any lavim into the picture. But he thinks rather that we could derive from this that if a person would have 100 oxen and 100 donkeys, and he does one act of charisha with all these 200 animals, he would only get 1 chiyuv malchus. That's Tosas Rabbeinu Peretz. Again, he's arguing against the bulk of the Rishonim, who would say that the reason why the Mishnah didn't mention multiple animals is simply because the Mishnah is trying to get multiple lavim. In any event, we have now the next violation of a lav, and that is vehein mukdashim, which means that, let's say, the shar itself, again, we cannot say about the chamar because the chamar is a behemoth mea, but in the case of the shar could be what's called kadshe mizbeach. And what happens is that the Torah says with regard to kadshe mizbeach, lo savod bibchar shorecha. And this is also a pasuk in Parshas Kitetze. No, it's a little bit early actually. It says lo savod bibchar shorecha. Now, Kodshei Mizbeach, as a general rule, are often, the Torah uses the paradigm of Bechor. But Bechor, again, is just a category. It's not a specific halacha in Bechor. There are unique halachas in Bechor, but not this lav. The lav of doing avoda with Kodshei Mizbeach, which is derived from Lo Sabed B'Bechor, applies to all Kodshei Mizbeach. Now, as I said before, in the case of the Chamor, you don't have what's called Kodshei Mizbeach, but you can be Magdish a Chamor as what's called Kedushas David, which means that it doesn't have Kedushas Guf, Lemizbeach, but it does have Kedushas David. And if it has Kedushas David, then if you use that Chamor, which has the status of Hegdesh L'David, for your own personal purposes, then you violate an Isur Me'ilah. So although the Chamor is not Roy Lahakriv Al Gabi Mizbeach, it's Kodesh L'David, what we call Kedushas Perek HaBayis, and that itself engenders an Isur. Then it happens to be that it's Kilaya Keren. What exactly is he doing with this Harisha? He's doing a Harisha between the Gefanim, between the vines. And what happens is that if these vines have Zroim of other vegetation besides grapes, besides vine, in close proximity, then one of the violations of Kilayim, I'm not talking about when he has Hana from the Kilayim itself, I'm talking about the lav of creating Kilayim. So there's something called Lotizra Karmacha Kilayim. And that violation can occur even through Harisha. And why is that so? Because Zriya has two dimensions to it. One is when you take the seed and put it into the ground, and the other is when you cover the seed with soil. Now, what he does is with this Harisha, the soil spills over on the two sides of the machresha, of the plow, and in this particular scenario, it covers a combination of the vine with Zraim. So he's got the Zraim in close proximity to the vine, and now he covers the two of them together with soil, so they grow underneath the ground. So his Harisha now is a violation of Lotizra Karmacha Kilayim. And we go on now to Daf Mem Zayin Amud Beis Ushvius. It's really clever. And the Mishnah engineers this. It happens to be the 7th year of Shemitah. And the Torah says, Ubashana Shvius Sodcha Lotizra, you're not allowed to plant. Now, there's a very interesting comment here of Rashi, which you'll see here on the top of the Amud. Rashi says, the over Mishum Sodcha Lotizra, which is, of course, at the end of Sefer Vayikra. But then he writes, Bechoresh Tolda Dizorea. Now, this is very interesting. If we take Rashi literally, that Choresh is a Tolda of Zorea, then Rashi is assuming, which is actually a Machlokas Amoraim at the beginning of Masechet Moed Katan, that there are Toldos during Shvius. We assume, we associate Toldos with Shabbos. There are Avos and Toldos. The Gemara actually derives Toldos and Shabbos, the entity of Toldos in general, from a pasuk. There's an extra Yitur Dekra that teaches me that in addition to the Avos Malachos that were performed in the Mishkan, there were also Toldos, and each one of the Avos has its own Toldos. We don't have a parallel drasha with regard to Shmius. And therefore, if Harisha is nothing more than a Tolda of Zriya, which means to say that the Torah never prohibited Harisha, but the Torah said you're not allowed to be Zorea in Shmius, and Harisha is a Tolda because when he does the Harisha, he covers the seeds, then Rashi's assuming there are Toldas in Shmius. And the truth be told, that Rava in Masechet Moed at the very beginning of the Masechet denies the existence of toldos in Shvius. And this is very problematic that Rashi would, incur the shita of Rabba instead of Rava against Rava with regard to toldos in Shvius. And this is a kasha that's asked by almost all the Achronim. There's a whole list here, quoted here in my footnote here, the Rashash, the Char Melech, the Minchas Chinuch. They all can't figure out how Rashi can be reconciled with Rava, who holds that in Shvius there is no chiyuv on toldos of malachos. Why would we get Malchus for being choresh in Shvius as a tolda of Zoreah? Chazon Ish comes up with a very original, imaginative reinterpretation of Rashi. That the word tolda in Rashi doesn't mean the technical word tolda, as it's used in Kol HaTorah Kula, as an av and a tolda, but rather the word tolda means it's a repercussion, it's a tolda, it's an impact. In other words, the result of his charisha, in the sense that he covers over the soil, is that he's being zoreah, but it's not a tolda of zoreah, it's actually zoreah, because there are two forms of zriah. One is where you put the seed in the ground, and the other is the seed is in the ground and you cover the seed with soil. Again, I'm not telling you that this is the only way of learning Rashi, because the Achronim did not learn Rashi in this very original way. But be that as it may, I mentioned the Chazon Ish. So how many lavim have we violated so far, up to date? We had Choresh B'Shar V'Chamor Yachtov. We had Choresh B'Shar Mukdashim, or Chamor Mukdashim in Kodshei Berek Habayis. We have now Kilayim, Vaya Kerem, and now we have number 4 is Shvius. So we got to get another 4 to make it up to the number 8 for Chanukah. So he says, Ubi Yontif. The Torah says regarding Yontif, Kol Moleches Avodah Lo Sasu, and therefore Karisha is one of the avodos, one of the malachos, that's included Kol Moleches Avodah Lo Sasu with regard to Yontif. And that's in Parshas Emor. That's going to be a big problem, because we'll see how the Gemara is going to apply Hoil for Charisha. And that's going to be Rav Chiz's kasha on Rabbah. Again, you and I would say intuitively, there's no relationship whatsoever between Charisha and Orchid. It's very nice that you're plowing your field and you're encouraging the Zriya process. I don't know if that's gonna warm up the bed of your guests, But anyway, we're going to see about Kisi Adam. That's going to be a different application of the principle of Hoil. Then we go on to the next violation, and that is Kohen V'Nazir. Okay, so we're talking about a person who's doing this Charisha, and he's not only a Kohen, he also is a Nazir, because a Kohen is like any other Jew, is allowed to be Makabel on himself Nazirus. And what's the big deal about this Charisha as far as a Kohen or a Nazir is concerned, in this case both? A base Hatuma. In other words, where is this Charisha? We thought the Charisha was out in the fields, in the open fields. But as it turns out, this Charisha was in a base HaKvaros. And the Torah says at the beginning of Parshas Emor, Amor LaKohanim, etc., L'nefesh lo yitama bi'amo. In the case of a Nazir, the Torah in Parshas Nosel says, Kol Yemei Ha'izaro L'Hashem Al Nefesh Meis Lo Yavo. And this is going to jack us up to 8 Lavin. Let's go through the 8. We have Klai Behema, we have Malacha B'Kodshei Mizbeach. Then we said that with the Chamor is Kodshei Berek Habayis, and that's a violation of Me'ilah. So we have 3. We have Zoreah B'Klai HaKerem, so that jacks it up to 4. Because again, Klai Behema is not the same as Klai HaKerem. Klai Behema is Shor V'Chamor Yachtov, the very active Charisha. Forget about Zriya. But in the case of Zoreah B'Klai HaKerem, it means that he's violating Zriya because of the dirt that spills over and covers the zera and the vine. Now up to number 5, which is Oreah Shvius. Number 6 was Choresh B'Yontif. And now we jack it up from 6 to 8 when we assume that this is going on in a Beis HaKvaros, and we're talking about a Kohen who is a Nazir. So we have the violation of a Kohen who is L'Nefesh Lo Yitamav. We have the violation of a Nazir, Al Nefesh Beis Lo Yovo. So we now have, all told, 8 violations. This is the way Rashi calculates the number 8. Tosfos does not calculate Moel Behegdich in the case of the Chamor. He's only interested in the Shor, which is Kodesh Mizbeach. But Tosfos says that in Klai HaKerem, he violates 2 separate lavin. There's one lav for Klai Zroim and another lav for Klai HaKerem. So if Yirtzeh Hashem, if we get a chance, we'll get a little bit of a picture of Kilayim and why there might be 2 different violations and 2 different Chiyuv Malchus in the case of Kilayim, one for Zroim and the other for Keren. In other words, he's mixing 2 seeds, and there's a separate law for each one of those 2 seeds vis-a-vis the other seed. So he's violating the Zroim and the Keren. Now, as far as Yontif is concerned, we mentioned that the Torah says Kol Melechas Avoda Lo Sasu, and Charisha itself is one of the 39 melachas that are prohibited on Shabbos and Yontif. And the question now arises, why doesn't he get Malchus twice on Yontif? Once for Meleches Charisha, and a second time for Meleches Zorea, because as we said over and over again here, the underlying thread that that makes this whole Mishnah logical is the fact that through Charisha he does Zriya. And if you'll argue it's only a Tolda, that's not going to help you on Yontif, because on Yontif there are Toldas. So why is it that we're counting Yontif only as one violation and one Chiyuv Malchus, when in fact there should be 2 Chiyuv Malchus, one for Choresh and the other for Zoreah? Now, if we assume, like those Rishonim, that the number 8 here is not the sum total of how many sets of Malchus he gets, because certain Lavim may repeat themselves over and over again. Like, for example, we mentioned if he was Choresh with 2 Shvarim and 2 Chamorim, he would get 2 sets of Malchus, but that's not included here in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is counting up Lavim. How many violations of different Lavim as categories can you have? But if, on the other hand, we go with the approach that the Mishnah is telling us an exact number of how many sets of Malchus he's going to incur, then why is Yontif counted as 1 and not as 2? So this is a big sugya called Ha'osa Melachos Shonos B'Maisa Echad. When a person violates many different melachos with one Maisa, does he get an Onesh? Does he get Malchus in the case of Yontif, for example, or perhaps even in the case of Shabbos, if there was Hasra for Malchus? One set of Malchus for the entire scope, the entire cadre of Malachas, or does he get a separate set of Malchus for each violation of each Malach, even though he did it all with one Maisa? And this is called the famous sugi of Chiluk Malachas. However, the Gemara establishes that Yesh Chiluk Malachas l'Shabbos, the Ein Chiluk Malachas b'Yontif. In Shabbos, there's especially Alfusa that teaches me that you can get 2 sets of Malchus for violating 2 Malachas with one Maisa, but we don't have a parallel in Yontif. And the reason for that is because whereas in Shabbos there are 39 different violations, each malacha represents its own chilul Shabbos, its own avera. In the case of Yontif, it's all one. There are many different methods by which you violate one single malacha, which is chilul yontif. So when the Torah says, with regard to yontif, kol meleches avodah lo sasu, it means all the malachas of Shabbos, with which each in the context of Shabbos is a separate avera, they all integrate to form one single avera with regard to yontif. And therefore, if you violate both charisha and zriya simultaneously on yontif with one maisa, you'll get only one set of malchus. Now, what does Rav Chizda see in this Mishnah in Masechet Makos that can be relevant to the principle of Hoil? Dr. Rav Chizda, the Amrin in Hoil, if you can apply as Rabbah does the principle of Hoil, then I have a question for you. With regard to Yontif, we should apply the principle of Hoil as far as Meleches Charisha is concerned, and it would not generate Malchus. How did the Mishnah mention Yontif here as one of the 8? What about Hoil? So what is the Hoil in the case of Charisha on Yontif? It certainly is not, as we said before, Hol V'Kloi Orch. Gemara says that Hoil v'chazi lekisui dam tzipor. Now you realize that on Yontif you're allowed to shech an animal or a bird, and in the case of a bird, also in a chaya, not a behema, there's a mitzvah of kisui adam. The Torah says, "Vayikra Yitzayin ve'ish ish mipnei Yisrael nagera garbus ocham asher yatzut tzayid chaya o of." Right, chaya o of, asher ye'achel, is the Torah says, v'shafach es damo, v'kiso bi'ofar. So that if occasion will have it, that he needs ofar for the mitzvah of v'chiseu bi'ofar, because he shechted it off on Yontif, then this Harisha set up or gave him access, shall we say, to the offer that he needs for Kisui Hadam in the case of Shchitas Sipor. So now, let's say that he didn't anticipate shechting birds, or not so many birds, or so many chayos on Yontiv, but mizdami lo, right? That's hoil. Hoil mizdami le orchim, mizdami lo shchute or shchitas tziporim, and he needs offer. So now, igloi milsul mafreya, that the charisha that he did facilitated the mitzvah of Kisei Adam. Now, here we have a very interesting discussion here based on a sugya in Yevamis. The Gemara in Yevamis on Daf Hey has a principle called Esei Docha Losas. And in a case of a charisha on Yontif for the purpose of Kisei Adam, the lav, the avera of Kisei, is overridden, is trumped by the mitzvah of Kisei Adam, which itself is a big problem because we usually require what's called be'idna, simultaneity between the essay and the losa. Say here, the charisha precedes the Kisei Adam. So the Rishonim say, but what happens if he shechts the bird in close proximity to the charisha in such a way that when he does the charisha, the dam itself is available, and his charisha immediately becomes a fulfillment when it covers the dam of the mitzvah kisei adam. He has both the charisha and the kisui simultaneously. And again, if you ask me statistically, what are the chances that that's going to happen? But the Gemara is not interested in statistics here. You could be living on the moon And Rabbah would say that you're allowed to shecht on Yontif, on the moon, for the sake of Shabbos. Why? Because some guest is going to show up. What do you mean? I'm the only man on the moon. It doesn't matter. It's just a theoretical hoil. And if that be the case, we have a theoretical hoil here with regard to Charisha as an act of Kisi Adam in event that he shechted a bird on Yom Tov. Now I want to read to you 2 points over here before we go on to Rav Papa's attempt to defend Rabbah, but we're now holding in Rav Chizda's argument against Rabbah. He says the following. Rashi talks about a multiplicity of tziporim. If you take a look at the end of Rashi, Dibra Maskil Gam Tzipor, the last word in Rashi is tuva. Tuva means harbe, right? So he has harbe tziporim, or harbe chayos, and he needs kisi adam. And the Chassam Sofer, others try to interpret why Rashi insists on harbe, why Rashi had to add that word. Says the Chassam Sofer, Loken, if not for the extra word harbe, minayin lonu lahakshos shei poter al harish mitam zeh varei tochen shemedubar kisheyesh lo kfar afar muchan she'oz ein efshar sheyitztarech es ha'ofer she'israpi me'acharisha. He says the following, that maybe the Mishnah is talking about a case, according to Rabbah, where he's already prepared his afar mibod yom before going into Yontif. He doesn't need a haricha to get an additional volume of afar. But the hoil is if yizdamilo harbe tzipor v'chayos, then we can apply a hoil be matir the harisha, even if he has afar, because maybe he has enough afar for a certain number of chayos and tziporim, but he doesn't have enough afar that was prepared for this sudden volume of tziporim and ophos and chayos. Now, we mentioned earlier that in the case of Charisha, he violates 2 different malachas, Charisha and Zriya. He's only chayiv on the Charisha, because we said ein chiluk malachas beyond. So if he does 2 malachas and 1 ma'isa, he only incurs 1 chiyuv malchus. Now, the Gemara wants to suggest that he's not chayiv for the Charisha because of hoil, which means that he's allowed to do this Charisha if there's dam tzipor that needs kisi adam. So that Charisha is mutter, and we apply the principle of the Gemara and Yevamos of Esei Dochalosasa. But what happens to the malach of Zriya? Now, I understand very well he can't be chai for both Charisha and Zriya, but Luyat Suyar, we can exonerate him from the chiyuv of Charisha. Once we move Charisha out of the picture, we're not left with an empty space. We're left with the Zriya, which could not generate a chiyuv malchus because it was overridden or overshadowed by the Charisha. But now that he's not chayiv for the Charisha, he needed the Charisha for the Kisi Adam. But what about the Zriya? He is aiding and facilitating the growth of the vegetation that's planted by covering it up with afar. That has nothing to do with the dam of the tzipor. You follow? The dam of the tzipor is covered, but the soil is also covering Zroim. That was the case that we dealt with in the Mishnah, and hence he was chai for this Charisha for the malach of Sarchalo Tizra in Shvius. Or we spoke about, the case of Mukdashim, where the Torah says you're not allowed to do Zriya. So we're obviously talking about a case where the Charisha itself is an act of Zriya. All right, he's not chayiv for the Charisha because he needs the Charisha for the Kisi Adam. But what does he need the Zriya for? Meaning that aspect of covering the Zroim, right? Or for example, in the case of Kilayim, Shvius, all those cases, is Yesh L'chayvo al Azriya. The Zriya is not necessary for Kisui Dam Tzibor. He says the following, that we misunderstood the kasha of Rav Chizda. We thought Rav Chizda was saying that how can you come up with 8 sets of Malkus here in this Mishnah in Makis, because Yontif does not generate a Chiv Malkus because of the principle of Esei Dochalosase, Hoil, he has, or he might have, Dam Tzipor for Kisu. No. That wasn't Rav Chizda's intention. Because in fact, even Rav Chizda will agree that given Hoil, he still gets Malkus for Yontif, albeit not for Meleches Choresh, but for Meleches Zoreah. So what was his kasha? His kasha was from the diuk in the lashon of the Mishnah in Makis. Yesh Choresh Elem Echad v'chayav olav olev mishum shmona lavin. He understood that the Harisha per se generates 8 sets of Malkus. And that's what the Gemara is going to say, Acharisha lo l'chayav. Right? That's the language of Rav Chizda, is Acharisha lo l'chayav. He should be chayav for the Harisha. He doesn't say Ayontif lo m'chayav. Take out the word Yontif here in the Mishnah. No. Yontif, even if you accept Hoil, is very appropriate in this Mishnah because the Mishnah wants to give you 8 violations of Malkus. But in the case of the Mishnah indicates clearly that he's violating Meleches Choresh. Yesh Choresh Telem Echad v'chayav aleh mishum shmona Malkus. Fine. The Maram Chalva has a slightly different twist on Rav Chizda's kasha. He says that Afal Azriya Eino Chai. He's not going to be Chai for Meleches Zoreah. And that was Rav Chizda's kasha. Take out Yontif entirely. Keva Deinu Chai Mishum Zoreah L'Mikoch Harisha. In this case, it's only the Harisha that generates a Zriya. The Ikar Maisa Hu Hazriya. The Agav HaCharisha Nase Chipui HaKarka and Meleches Zoreah. Is therefore, if it's Agav, which means that we define the Ikar Maisa, and if there's a Ptur on the Ikar Maisa, which in this case is Harisha, is Memele Potter Af Al Hazriya. In other words, a Zriya is like an offshoot. It's like a child of its parent. The parent is Harisha, that's the Iker Malach. And if there's no Chiv Malkus on the parent, then there cannot be a Chiv Malkus on the child. That's the Maram Chalva. And what it really means is that, let's say if we go back to the main sugya of 2 malachos that were achieved with 1 maisa. The case is Zomer v'tzorech li'etzim. So he prunes the tree, which is Meleches Notea. Notea is the same as Zoreah, just that Zoreah is in Zroim and Notea is in Ilonos. And at the same time, he is cutting down the branch, and he'll use the branches for, fuel for his fire, for his campfire. He now has violated Meleches Kotzer. So he has a double violation with 1 Maisa of Zomer as a Malacha of Zoreah. Again, technically it's called Notea. And Meleches Kotzer. Now the Iker Malacha here is clearly Meleches Zoreah, Notea. Meaning, why is he pruning his tree? Because he wants to improve the productivity of the tree. Got to get rid of these, prune his tree. He also, Memela takes the twigs or whatever was cut down, the branches, and he throws it into his campfire. And he's chayav from Meleches Kotzer, but that's already the tofel, not the ikar. And the ikar is kover for the tofel. Says Ramchalva, if lu yitzu, you be potter for whatever reason on the ikar malacha, that Torah will extend to the tofel, to the secondary malacha that he also implements, because the secondary malacha is viewed as an offshoot, like a told of the Av. And if you're potter for the Av, then for sure you're going to be potter for the told. So we have here a machlokas as to whether or not Rav Chizda intended to completely remove Yontif from the list, or was he only removing Charisha from the list? But Enochinami, he be Chayev Izriya. Amar Rav Papa Bar Shmuel be'avonim mikur zelos. We are looking for an ukimta in this Mishnah in Makis, which makes it impossible for that Harisha to serve as a kisui for the dam tziporim of shchita. And the reason is because the mitzvah of kisui requires afar. And what he's doing here in this Harisha case is he's breaking up the stones, right? There are certain stones that are very relatively soft, and therefore they're royal Izriya. And he uses these stones for Izriya purposes. But these stones are not Ru'uyos L'Kisi Adam. So we have here the law of the excluded middle. We finally came up with some case where the afar on the one hand has the propensity, has the power for Zriya, and hence he's violating Mechaz Oreah with this Harisha, but it does not have the potential, it's not a candidate for Kisi Adam. Why is that? Because it's Avonim Mikarzalos. And Avonim Mikarzalos are not Roy Lekisi Adam. That is the theory of Rav Papa. But the Gemara is going to go through stage after stage and continuously back and forth undermine Rav Papa's preposition. For example, the Gemara says, Ruyos Lekocham. What are you telling me? You're telling me that these are very hard stones, or they're soft stones, but sharp stones, and you cannot achieve Kisi Adam? What do you mean you can't achieve Kisi Adam? Why don't you just take these stones and crush them and make them into Afar? That's also included in Hoil. Hoil doesn't have to mean that the situation arises and the malach that I did is perfect for that situation, meaning it's l'tzorech yantif, because I need the shchit, I need the kisi adam, the dam tzipor. It could be that I need to do X and then Y in order to get to my goal of Z. It's number one, charisha. Number two, I need ktisha to pound away at this Evan Mekurzalos and make it finally off. But that too should be included in the heter of Hoid. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Uktisha biyantif mishari. Would you be allowed to pound and crush avonim on yantif to make them into afar for the purpose of kisui hadam? The Gemara says we can't go as far as Ketisha. Ketisha is a violation of Meleches Tochen, and Meleches Tochen is not permissible for the sake of Kisi Adam, because Ketisha is already 2 stages away, 2 steps away, is far removed from the actual Kisi Adam. We could say Esed Dochalosis and Charisha, insofar as when he plows the ground, the soil flows over and covers the Zrayim, or in the case of Dam, covers the Dam. But Ketisha, wait a minute, Ketisha is already a preliminary stage to set up Ofar. It's not part of the actual Kiyuma mitzvah of Kisui, it's just a Echsher mitzvah. Well, that's not going to be enough to apply the principle of Esei Dochalosa. So we've solved the problem of Be'indo and Esei Dochalosa in the case of Harisha, and the Harisha itself generates the Kisui. But in the case of Ketisha, the Ketisha is not Kisui. It may be your necessary precondition to get the offer so that you can be Mekayim and implement the mitzvah of Kisui, but it's not Kisui. And therefore, there's no essay that could override the malacha of Ketisha on Yom Tov. Now, in the note that I have here, he says, Ein lahatir mikam esei dochalosa ela ba'ofen shemekayim es ha'esei b'shas averes Allah uba'avonim eino yochel lekayim es kisi adam b'shas ha'charisha kevan shetzorach lekocham kodem lechem. A little bit of a different presentation than what I said. I said that there's nothing to override Ketisha. I think that's a valid point. He's going on and saying that the Harisha itself, there's nothing to be mad to the Harisha because the Harisha per se could not achieve the mitzvah of Kisi Adam. And I think both statements, both prepositions are correct. There's nothing to override Harisha because he's doing Harisha on Avonim Mikur Zalos. And at the same time, there's nothing to override Ketisha because Ketisha is not a malacha that can be implemented simultaneous with the Kiyuma mitzvah, in this case of Kisi Adam. Mar now tries to deflect this objection of Ketisha and say that maybe the Torah would allow Ketisha. How? Re'uyos l'koshom kil achar yad. We have a principle that in malachos, whether it be Shabbos or Yontif, you have to do it meleches machshavos the way it's normally done, the perfect way. But if you implement it in an unusual way, which means in this case, kil achar yad, with a shinui, then what you do is reduce the Isur Torah down to an Isur Rabbanan, because kil achar yad is potter aval osir. It's potter as far as Torah law is concerned, and it becomes osir midrabanan. So therefore, the Gemara says that in the case of choresh ba'avonim v'korzolos, you could find a way of using that harisha for achieving and implementing the mitzvah of Kisi Adam. Again, you might have to add Ketisha into the equation, but the Ketisha itself is being done kelachar yad, and therefore he'd be potter for harisha and potter for Ketisha. He's potter for Ketisha because it's kelachar yad, and he's potter for harisha because he has a mitzvah of Kisi Adam, which overrides the law of harisha beyond. So the bottom line is we're still stuck back at square one in Rav Chizda's objection against Rabbah from this Mishnah in Malchus. We still don't understand why he should get Malchus for Harisha, since and even if I grant you that the case is Harisha of ground that has stones, Mikruzozos, nevertheless, there still is a possibility of fulfilling the mitzvah of Kisi Adam with this Harisha, albeit we need a preliminary stage of Ketisha, but that's okay because he's going to do the Ketisha kelachar yad. So the Gemara again tries to fine-tune this ukimta as to what the reality of the scenario is in the Mishnah in Makis. And the Gemara says that it's a case of tsunma. Tsunma, this I know from Masechet Bava Basra. In Cheskes Habatim, the question is, if the machzik claims that he was in the land for 3 years, he's got to do various farming, agricultural actions in order to prove that he's the Bailim and incur the wrath of the original Mavakama, so he makes him a Chah. But the Gemara says if there's a Tsudma, it's a large boulder in the field, we can't expect him to do much. Like, for example, Katisha, right? You want to convert this soil into Afar for the purpose of Katisha, Kisi. Well, you can't do Katisha on a Tsudma. It just doesn't lend itself to Katisha. And therefore, in that case, since there's no possibility of Katisha, and he doesn't have Afar, so there's no possibility of Kisi Adam, therefore, he will not be potter midin hoil, because there's no hoil here, there's no potential in the case of Tsudma for the mitzvah of Kisi Adam. But the Gemara says the following: the entire Mishnah and Makkos from beginning to end is predicated on the fact that he is Zorea, that there are Zroim here, right? He's violating Shar v'Chamar Yachtav and Zriya B'Shvius and Zriya on Yont. I mean, all these cases of Zriya mean, by definition, that through his Charisha, he is improving and facilitating the growth of a Zera. Well, if it's a Tsudma case, just like it's impossible to do Katisha, it's impossible to do a Zriya, a Charisha of Zriya. Charisha of Zriya is impossible in a Tsudma. Is Tsudma bar Zriya? He asks it as a rhetorical question. Is it possible, to plant a seed on a gigantic boulder? So therefore, the Gemara now is rejecting the teretz that we offered to defend Rabbah. We said, according to Rabbah, the reason why in this Mishnah there's no possibility of Kisei Adam is because we're talking about Tsudma. How could you possibly suggest in Ukimta in this Mishnah in Makkos that we're talking about Tsudma? The whole Mishnah is predicated on Zriya. There's no Zriya in Tsudma. So the Gemara answers, Tsudma milamala, the Afar tichoach milamata. He's chayav mishum zorea, because with his chrisha, some of the Zroim go into the Afar tichoach. Right? It says Afar tichoach milamata. So it's interesting. You have a sela, this gigantic boulder, and you have crushed earth underneath the boulder, which is called Afar Tichoach. And he's going to be chai for Choresh because he does Charish on the sela milamala, right? The Charisha doesn't go all the way down the mata, it only goes on the surface level. And in the case of a Tsudma, which is lamala, there's no possibility of Kisi Adam. You asked me, why does he violate Harisha? And the answer is because there's Afar Tichuach Lamata. So once he gets rid of the Afar of the Tsudma Lamala, then he exposes the Afar Tichuach Lamata. And now he's Chayv Michum Zoreh, because through his Harisha, the Zraim now penetrate deeper and deeper into the Afar Tichuach, which is underneath the Sela. But he can't be Chayv Mishum Chorich, because the Charish, as we said before, is on the surface level of Mala, and that's where you have a Tzudma, you have a Sela. Once again, Ramos, if we make the calculation, we're up to a kasha on Rab. We're still left with a kasha on Rab, correct? Why? because he could have the possibility of violating, of not violating is the word I wanted to use, not violating Meleches Charisha if Hoil means that he has Dam Tzipor and he needs the Charisha for the sake of Kisui Adam. Now, what happens is, through the Charisha of the Tzudma Lamala, he now exposes the Ofra Tichuach Milamata, and he can now use this Ofra Tichuach for the mitzvah of Kisui Adam. So back to the kasha of why don't we say this Hoil that he should be parted from Malchus in the Mishnah in Malchus for Charisha B'Yontiv because of Hoil. He might actually have an occasion to fulfill the mitzvah of Kisui Adam. And even if you'll tell me he can't do Kisui Adam with the Lamala level, which is Tzudma, but once he gets rid of the Lamala level, he now exposes Ofra Tichach, and Ofra Tichach is Roy Lizrika, to Kisui Adam. Ela Omar Mar Barav Ashi Bitina. What kind of Harisha are we talking about in this Akimta of Mar Barav Ashi in the Mishnah in Makis? We're talking about Tina. Tina means soft, a soft like cement-like substance. And what's going on over here? There's no possibility of saying Hoil because he's Choresh Betina, and it's Eno Roy L'Kisui Adam. So he has once again a possibility of violating Meleches Choresh, but there's no Hoil, and there's no possibility of Kisui Adam because we're talking about Tit. Now, if Tit is some sort of cement, mud substance that does not lend itself to Kisui Adam, because as we said, Kisui requires Ofar Tichach, is it possible to do Zriya in mud? Why would he be violating Meleches Zoreah through this Harisha? Like, for example, we spoke about Zoreah, but Kalayim Zoreah, Shvius, where's the Meleches Zoreah in a case of Tina? So the Gemara answers Bimatunta. So again, Matunta is going to be our solution to cut out this niche, which on the one hand, it's Roy le Zriya, but on the other hand, it's not Roy le Kisui Adam. What is Matunta? So my translation says it's Adama Lacha. It's soft ground. That's Re'uyel Izriya, but it's not offer. So in other words, you can actually plant here in this soft mud, or let's call it Adama Lacha, the soft ground, but it's not offer. And if it's not offer, it's not Roy L'Kisui Adam. Therefore, you're going to get Malchus here. There's no Hoil. You can't say Hoil, well, I need this Harisha to prepare the mud or the soft ground for Kisui Adam in event that, he's got a ribui of Tziporim, of Shchitas Tziporim. So there's no Hoil here because there's no Kisui Adam. But there is a Harisha Sheyesh Ba Zriya. Even in Matunta, there is a possibility of Zriya. So he says here, Bi'adoma lacha ru'il Zriya val eno ru'il Kisui Adam kevan she'ninases ofar sheksheba lekotsha he nidbekes v'nigbeles. You might ask, well, why not take this Hadama and crush it down to make it into Afar for Kisui? The answer is you can't do that. It becomes the Bekes Nigbeles. It's like a dough almost, a mud dough, an earth clump. And therefore, Ketisha will not help you in this case because it's, Ketisha is when you take a dry substance which is relatively soft and you pound it down and you make it into Offer. That's in a case of something that's soft. But in the case of Matunta, what's going to happen through the Ketisha? It's just going to roll over and roll over again and again. But there won't be any possibility of creating Offer. Hence, there's no Hoil, and if there's no Hoil, you'll be Chayiv for Meleches Charisha because you can do Charisha in this Adama Lacha, and it's Re'uya L'Zriya. So just to summarize, this whole sugya is looking really for some case where the Charisha is a Zriya, but it doesn't lend itself to Kisi Adama. Esvei Abaye, again, we'll just introduce the new sugya. And once again, Abaye is going to raise a question on Rabbah from a brisa of Mevashel Gid Hanoshe. Again, once again, we have a Mishnah, in this case a brisa, that tries to generate multiple Malkios for one Maisa. So number one, he was Mevashel on Yontif. Number two, he was Mevashel Gid Hanoshe Bechalav, and the Torah says Osavashel Gedi Bachalevi Mo. Now, this is a problem if you assume what's called the Ein Beginim B'Nosei Tam. But let's assume now Yesh Beginim B'Nosei Tam, which means that the status of a Gid is that of Basar. And if that be the case, like, for example, if a person were to eat Gid Hanoshe B'Beimat Tmeah, you get two sets of malchus, one for Gid and the other is for Beimat Tmeah, because we're holding that Gid is also part and parcel of the Basar. It has the time of the Basar. And if the Basar is Beimat Tmeah, he gets malchus for Beimat Tmeah. Here we're talking about a case where he cooks Gid Hanoshe with milk. And if we're assuming that Gid Hanoshe is Basar, then he violates the Isser of Bishul Basar B'Chol. So now, in effect, he has how many sets of Malchus? Mevashel Gid Hanoshe. V'ochlo. Oh, he eats this concoction. So not only does he cook Gid Hanoshe, but he cooks Gid Hanoshe with Chalav. And what you have is Basar B'Cholav. And it's Yontif. So he violates Bishul on Yontif because this is not something that's Royal Achila. So he can't apply the principle of Ochel Nefesh to a Cheftzeh D'Isura to Basar B'Cholav. So in addition to violating Meleches Bishul, he also violates the Aver of Yontif, because this Bishul, as we said, is not Litzorach Yontif, and the Ochla. So he violates Gid Hanoshe, Basar B'Cholav, and Yontif. Loke Chamesh. How so? How do you get 5 sets of Malchus? Loke Mishum Mevashel Gid Hanoshe B'Yontif. As we said, it's not Litzorach Achila. Number 2, Loke Mishum Ochel Gid. Number 3, Loke Mishum Mevashel Basar B'Cholav. Again, we're assuming now Yesh Begin B'Nosei Tam. And Loke Mishum Ochel Basar B'Cholav. So how many do we have here? Again, let's go over it again. We have Mevashel Gid Hanoshe B'Yontif. We have Ochel Gid Hanoshe, We have Mavashal Basa B'Cholov and Velokim Mishum Ochel Basa B'Cholov. So why would you get Malchus for Bishul if we have the principle of Hoy? So Belina tomorrow, we're going to try to analyze this Gemara because what's Hoil in Bishul here? There's no Tzorech Ochel Nefesh. And if guests come, he can't. The Gemara is now going to focus on the last of the 5 Malchus on this list, and that's Havara. He turns on the fire for the purpose of Bishul. Now, although the Bishul itself could never be L'tzorech Yontiv, but the Havara could be L'tzorech Yontiv in many different possible ways. Either he needs the Havara to heat up his house, or he needs the Havara to cook some, kosher pot on Yontiv. And now the question is, if the Bryce as we have it is the correct year, so the Gemara is going to question that. And how can the Bryce say that he gets Malchus or Havara, Velokim Mishum Havara, as the 5th of the set of Malchus, when the Havara can certainly be through Hoil L'tzorech Ochel Nefesh. So let's just make a note of where we got to. Esvei Abaye Hamavashel Gina Noshe B'Chol B'Yontif B'Ochel Lo K'Chamesh.